You can see the title, Frenemy Next Door, Chinese Scholars' Perceptions of Japanese Foreign Policy under Prime Minister Abe. And this goes into the period that I mentioned, 2012 to 2020, when he stepped down as Prime Minister of Japan. And I think the images are quite illustrative of, I think, where some of our Chinese scholars sit in terms of thinking about where Prime Minister Abe was in terms of his foreign policy thinking and where Japan is. And the top right image, of course, is Japanese destroyers, the imperial flag, the revival of Japanese power, if you are thinking about Japanese military power through the lens of Kenneth Pyle. And of course, the caricature at the bottom shows Prime Minister Abe giving, a token of peace. And of course, behind his back is a samurai sword and the imperial flag. And I think this is it represents how some scholars think about Japan in the Chinese context, but I'm going to try and introduce you to some of the broader thinking that I was able to uncover in my research in China from 2012 to 2020. So I got to, okay. So I think the background is always important. We know clearly that China is the #2 in terms of the second biggest economy in the world. By purchasing power indexed by some estimates is even bigger than the United States. And Japan, since 2010, really has fallen behind China's economic growth, being the third largest economy, and likely in the coming 10 years, it may be the fourth, fifth, and sixth largest economy, depending on how successful the Indian economy is, as well as other economies within the region. Importantly, these two countries they're the largest trading partners for each other. Just last year, despite record unfavorable ratings in Japan of China and equally unfavorable ratings of Japan in China, Japan sold about $210 billion of goods to our Chinese friends. So $210 billion. That's it's big, right? It's more trade than I think many European countries do. So despite the dislike of each other, they understand the benefits of their bilateral trade relationship and how that trade relationship continues to fuel both countries' growth, and that it will be important for them to have some kind of functional relationship moving forward if they would like to have sustainable growth moving forward. Traditionally, they've engaged in something called sekkei bunri, which is the separation of politics and economics. Sometimes you'll hear the expression cold politics and hot economics. Well, this has become somewhat more fraught over the past 5 or 6 years as nationalism in China has spiked, that the COVID pandemic has made it more difficult for businesses and business leaders to travel between the two countries. And of course, we're not seeing students and scholars and others traveling to China or vice versa, which means we're not creating the new business opportunities that should be there. So in many ways, the sekkei bunri idea is breaking down, and it's breaking down because of the COVID-19 policies that have taken place in all countries in the region, but also geopolitics is very, very important. In terms of a driver of the dissolution of the sekkei bunri relationship. There's lots of mutual suspicion in this relationship, whether it's in 1994 with China testing a nuclear weapon, or in 2010, as I mentioned, or 2005 with former Prime Minister Koizumi visiting Yasukuni Shrine, or the 2010 incident where an Okinawan Chinese fisherman was arrested by the Okinawa government. And then, of course, the 2012 nationalization of the Senkaku Islands. All of this has raised suspicion on both sides of the East China Sea. Japan sees China as aggressive. They see Xi Jinping as expansionist, and the list goes on. And from China's point of view, of course, they see Japan in many ways. And this is going to be the crux of today's discussion. With a key factor that has brought both stability but also instability to the relationship has been Prime Minister Abe. I think most of us know Prime Minister Abe is seen as a conservative politician. He's seen as a hawk in many circles. I think in Western press, he's seen as a nationalist that's interested in turning Japan into a normal country, which means that Article 9 no longer becomes central to how Japan conceives its security and its engagement with the world. Others have seen him as instrumental in terms of re-engaging with the Chinese after the really disastrous engagement by the DPJ from 2008 to 2012. So there's a lot of different ways to be thinking about Prime Minister Abe, but I think three key areas for us to be thinking about is proactive pacifism, which is, I think, one of his key contributions to Japan's foreign policy. Collective security, the 2015 act in which he created 5 conditions for Japan to participate in collective security with allies and particular friends. And of course, history. In 2017, he released the cabinet statement of his view or his cabinet's understanding of history in the context of World War I and World War II. Other important things to be understanding within the context of today's discussion is, of course, nationalism. And nationalism is an increasingly difficult issue to deal with. I think it was a problem before the COVID-19 pandemic. And quite frankly, I think it has become a more divisive issue following the pandemic, with finger pointing of where the COVID-19 pandemic came from. Of course, stereotypical depictions of how different countries are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, nationalism associated with the strategic competition between the United States and China, which is really becoming more and more of a challenge for the region in general. Lastly, and I think importantly, and this began with the Obama administration, was the US rebalance. The United States taking some of its resources from the Middle East and some from Europe, and parking them in the broader Asia or Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. And I think this is an important aspect of thinking about how the Chinese are also thinking about Prime Minister Abe and his period as the Prime Minister and his approach to foreign policy within the region. So some key questions that I want to address, or I try to look at when thinking about this presentation, is how do international relations scholars in China view Japan's proactive pacifism? And again, this was done through a lot of unstructured interviews and very interesting perspectives came out. We also had scholars talking and thinking and interpreting the Japan's relationship with the United States and strengthening of the US alliance. How Chinese scholars understand Japan's cooperation with Southeast Asian countries in the South China Sea. And then lastly, how do they understand the change or reinterpretation of the Japanese constitution? So these were some questions that I was very much interested in asking my Chinese colleagues. And it was both a labor of love and a labor of moutai, and a lot of discussions, walking and talking and eating and drinking, because this is how you engage in qualitative research with Chinese scholars. Because of course, in a public setting, they're not going to say their views in the same way that they would say it over a dinner or over a drink. So it's important to start how has Chinese scholars written about Japan? And here there's a lot of different writing. And I think that gives us some hints of how Chinese scholars that look at the Japanese foreign policy have really tried to think about Japan's autonomous role in foreign policy, but also its role working with the United States or so-called like-minded countries. And here Zhang and Wang really articulated Japan's foreign policy as a component of America's rebalance to Asia and interest in Chinese containment. What's interesting about the period that this literature was written, of course, was prior to Obama, so under the Bush administration and during the Obama administration. And I think that this is important because both presidents were investing more resources within the region. And for these scholars, they understood Japan as being a conduit for that rebalance within the region. And you can see that this idea of Chinese containment was very important in how they were articulating not only Obama's policy, but also Bush's policy. Wang, on the other hand, talked about the connection between Prime Minister Abe's view of the region and his advocacy for value diplomacy. And we should remember that his first visit as Prime Minister wasn't to China or to Washington. It was to Southeast Asia, where he gave a speech in Indonesia about the importance of freedom of press, of democracy, of civil society, and cooperation and deepening relations with Southeast Asian countries. And I think this is really, really important, and it contrasts his first time as Prime Minister in 2005, in which his first visit was not to Washington or Southeast Asia, it was to Beijing in an effort to try and repair some of the damage associated with Prime Minister Koizumi's trips to Yasukuni Shrine. So Wang really looks at this value diplomacy and connects it and tries to connect the macro level of geopolitics. So Prime Minister Abe's interest in constraining Chinese behavior, but also looking at how he used China as a foil to concentrate power and to get reelected, in a sense, connecting domestic politics to geopolitics. Now, others have highlighted the connection between domestic Japanese politics and foreign policies. And quite frankly, that it's popular in the Japanese context to have nuanced but explicit view about China. And we continue to see this. Today, the Prime Minister Kishida has taken a somewhat nuanced approach, as evidenced at his Shangri-La dialogue speech, where he only mentioned China once, and where in contrast to Russia and North Korea, which he mentioned several times. And I think that this suggests that Prime Minister Kishida doesn't need to use China so much to consolidate his domestic priorities and his domestic position, where when Prime Minister Abe came into power, China was really an important factor in contributing to his consolidation of power within the LDP, but also being re-elected in 2012. Others have really talked about Japan foreign policy as part of a larger economics and security strategy, but not focusing so much on containment, but maintaining the status quo between China and Japan. And I find this interesting because it shows that there's a lot of diversity within the Chinese foreign policy sphere, rather than what we see coming from Xinhua or the Global Times. Again, now some of that initial research, I think, gives us a window into how some of these Chinese were thinking about Japan, but it was important to go and talk to more. So I tried to speak to a lot of Chinese scholars, and again, the more the better. So I talked to scholars in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and in both Cantonese and English, Japanese, and I had a Mandarin interpreter because my Mandarin is not strong enough to communicate in a nuanced level with Chinese scholars. So this was useful. And the reason why you go to all these different cities is because really they have a very different view about Japan. And the more distance you get from Beijing, the more clarity and more nuance that you get about how scholars are thinking about this important relationship. A lot of primary sources and secondary sources in English, Japanese, and Chinese. And again, about 150 hours of interviews. So it's always better to have more, but hopefully I can do some more when China opens up again. So in terms of discussion today, I think that really there's a lot we can talk about, but I think that there was 5 major schools of thought that I could tease out from my interviews with Chinese scholars. And I'm going to go through each one of them because I think that they are different, but they have some overlaps. And what's interesting about these 5 different points of view is that they are I think the literature that I initially examined, and start to think about Japan as a more autonomous player in some cases, but also some scholars really are firmly wedded to the view that Japan has foreign policy. The challenge is that I think that both of these conclusions are true. Under the Obama administration and today's Biden administration, these are orthodox US governments, and Japan doesn't need to have so much autonomy with those governments. But the Trump administration, of course, whether you like him or not, agree on that, a very unorthodox form of administration, which required Japan to demonstrate much more autonomy and leadership. And I think the joining and leading the CPTPP is a very good example of that. But we shouldn't look at that autonomy just through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but also through the plethora of other partnerships that Japan developed during that period. So here we have 5 schools, and I would like to kind of go through them step by step. And I find these really interesting, and we can borrow, I've mentioned Kenneth Pyle already in today's discussion, but Kenneth Pyle is, I think, one of the preeminent Japanese foreign policy scholars, the scholars that look at Japanese foreign policy. And he stressed this idea of our 5 categories of attentiveness to power, and that the Chinese seem to see that Prime Minister Abe was also embodying some of these principles. And Pyle, when he was thinking about the Meiji Restoration and thinking about how the initial samurai and that visited the United States and Europe, that they were very attentive to power, and they also were pragmatic, and they took they exhibited opportunism, that if they saw an opportunity within the international sphere, that they would take a chance and try to do something there. They adapted and accommodated. We can talk about these a little bit more. They demonstrated autonomy, and they strive for regional hegemony, and they were quite good at emulating the United States and Europe in many ways, but also at innovation. So with these kinds of backgrounds in mind, I think that some of our Chinese scholars, friends, looked at Japanese foreign policy under Prime Minister Abe as very much about the Japanese Renaissance or self-rejuvenation, and that for Prime Minister Abe, he was striving to create a sustainable, rejuvenated Japan that can function independently vis-a-vis China under the US Japan alliance system. So these scholars were schooled in Japanese history. They understood the Meiji Restoration, and arguably they understood the Taisho, Showa, and Heisei periods as well, and how Japan was able to shift its position according to power within the international system. So in a sense, these scholars were looking at Prime Minister Abe's view as, again, thinking about self-rejuvenation in the line of the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji Ishin. Others talked about it in terms of a new strategic initiative. And I think if you are familiar with Japanese foreign policy, Prime Minister Abe gave quite a prominent speech at CSIS in Washington back in 2013, I believe. And he talked about this idea of Japan is back, and that Japan would never be a second-tier power. And of course, the cover on Time magazine is representing him as, a superhero, and perhaps making Japan and reviving Japan requires a superhero. But they understood Prime Minister Abe's strategy in a slightly different way than the first category that understood Japan and Prime Minister Abe as trying to rejuvenate Japan. And here, the difference is that they saw Prime Minister Abe wanting to create a new strategic initiative where Japan's role within the region, in many ways breaking away from Yoshida's initial formulation of Japan's foreign policy, in which that it concentrated on economic development, and it farmed out its security to the United States. And there's a lot of truth to this particular point of view, and we can go into this after. But these scholars were also interesting because they looked at Japan's and they looked at Prime Minister Abe's own roots, and they understood that the initial samurai that were in charge of the Meiji Restoration came from the Yamaguchi Prefecture, or the former Chosun Han. And it was these individuals conceptualized how Japan could best compete with the imperial powers. And from their point of view, it was all about the economy. You have to build the economy first. Through a strong economy, you can build a strong military. And what's so interesting about this is that you hear a similar phraseology in today's China as well. So in this new grand strategic initiative that these scholars came up to, they believed that Prime Minister Abe was sequencing his initiatives in government to first focus on economic rejuvenation through the 3 arrows, or so-called Abe economics. The second step was security readjustment through the collective security law, secrecy law, and strengthening the Japan-US alliance, so-called building a keiretsu alliance system. So rather than a vertical hierarchy, it was something that sat side by side. And their view that the third step was both economic societal changes, structural change, to further consolidate economic and social competitive advantages for the long-term global role. And I think that this is really, really important, a long-term global role rather than just a regional role, or Japan having a secondary role to the United States. And they also understood that the response, or Prime Minister Abe's foreign policy initiatives, was based on a response to China, but China was not the target, but rather the lightning rod to marshal urgency for social change. And I think that this school of thought was quite nuanced, because it really looked at how Japan changed in the Meiji Restoration. They looked at the sequencing, but they also tried to look at the sequencing in terms of contemporary changes during his administration. And they also understood that China was not necessarily the target, but rather was something that could motivate, or they thought that was motivating change in the Japanese context. Others had a different view of Abe's grand strategy, and they thought, or they looked at Abe's political statements and his sequential implementation as initiatives. And they were really looking at Prime Minister Abe's personal desire to maintain a position of relative equality vis-a-vis China, and maintain a position of superiority, in at least qualitatively, within the region. And they looked at him as being very what we call a realist approach to foreign policy, in that it was really important to fortify Japan's role in international institutions in order to continue to compete successfully with Japan within the region. And they used a lot of really interesting evidence when they were talking about this particular nuanced view of Japan, of Abe's strategic initiative. And they were talking about the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, about Abe leading the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as really strong evidence that the best way that, or how they understood Abe's thinking, was the best way to meet and secure Japan's needs and deal with the power changes within the region was to strengthen Japan's position within international organizations. And this school of thought is also really interesting. And next week, while Prime Minister Kishida is in Spain at the NATO summit, I will be in Poland. And this is really, I think, indicative of the transformative change of Japan in international institutions, whether it's the G7 or NATO. Now we see Japanese representatives in these international institutions and organizations trying to inculcate Japan into these organizations, so that they are seen as a global player. And I think this is really, really interesting because it's a slightly different view than the previous case, the previous idea of just building a strong economy, making local changes in the local in security alignment so that they could change and again be more competitive over the long term. This particular group was thinking about how Japan was inserting itself in international institutions. Another school of thought really focuses on the traditional, and I think, you know, it's a repetitive meme about Japan as a junior partner in a US containment strategy. And here, even if you listen to Wang Yi, the foreign minister and state counselor, we continue to hear this view that Japan is you know, siding with the wrong country. It's involved in a containment strategy. This is Cold War mentality. And we still see this kind of narrative at the elite level, but also within scholars. And they use evidence of Japan's position as a junior partner within the US-Japan alliance to contain China. And the evidence they use is the US pivot or rebalance to the region, with Japan being a strong partner, the TPP as being an economic tool to constrain China's growth. They look at the US-Japan alliance as, you know, if it's not about containment, then what is it about? This is their view. And they look at the incremental changes in Japan's self-defense forces or military since the 1990s, both in terms of the activities that they can engage in within the region, but also the geographic scope as examples of the Japanese expanding their position, expanding their cooperation with the United States. And they also talk about their norm building, their economic and military cooperation within the region. And they view that Japan's increased cooperation within the region is very much about China's rise, but also a misinterpretation of Chinese interests. This continues to be the meme, I think, and the explanation by the Chinese government. This particular position is closest to the Chinese government, but it's not necessarily indicative of what more nuanced thinkers think in the Chinese context about Japanese foreign policy. So I think this is interesting in itself, but it's not necessarily representative of the thinking within China. Others have looked at this as Japan, and they look at it through the lens of what we call hedging and engagement. In that, in hedging literature, if you've known anything about it, they focus on what we call opportunity maximization versus risk mitigation. So opportunity maximization is basically you want to have the best relationship possible, trade the most, deepen your engagement as much as possible. But risk mitigation is thinking about how you can, you need to seriously or think about the challenges associated with another state. And this particular school of thought looks at Japan's position through the lens of hedging and engaging, that Japan is clearly worried about China, but it's not necessarily 100% confident in the United States position and security guarantees to Japan. And as a result, it's hedging not just with China, but also with the United States. And it's also engaging with both of these countries through trade. And this is really, really interesting for us to be thinking about, because we often hear very negative views about China in Japan, but its leaders have signed a regional comprehensive economic partnership with China. Last year, it came into fruition in January 2020 or 2022, or sorry, January 2021. They are on paper considering China's entry into the TPP-11. And there's still talk about a trilateral free trade agreement between China, Japan, and South Korea. So we see this engagement, but we also see hedging, where Japan is investing in the quadrilateral security dialogue, recently signed the so-called reciprocal access agreements with Australia and the UK, and this year we'll probably see a couple others. And we see Japan being more proactive within the region in terms of diplomacy and providing and supporting the defense capabilities of countries in Southeast Asia. So this particular view, again, is nuanced because it shows that the Chinese understand that the Japanese are not necessarily 100% confident in their relationship with the United States either. Lastly, and I think we can never talk about or never not talk about domestic politics in the Japanese context, and the fact that Japan continues to not be open to foreigners right now, even though other countries have opened up completely, has to do with domestic politics. And anything with regards to China is useful in domestic politics. And these scholars seem to understand that Japan at the political level will engage in anti-Chinese rhetoric and talking about bold foreign policy to build a political support for Prime Minister Abe and the LDP. In this particular case, the agenda that the Chinese are thinking about is mostly focusing on constitutional change and historical revisionism. I'm not agreeing with their views, rather I'm trying to share how they think about, again, Prime Minister Abe's foreign policy. But in a nutshell, I think that most felt that the anti-Chinese card that was used in Japanese foreign policy really had no particular strategy. In a sense, it was instrumentalization of nationalism for domestic power consolidation. And this is not a particularly Japanese thing. I think that we see this in many countries where politicians will use an outside actor to try and consolidate power. But I found that the fact that they didn't recognize a broader strategy throughout the period of Prime Minister Abe to be somewhat myopic, because I think Prime Minister Abe has been pretty consistent in trying to constrain China's behavior and embed Japan into the region's political economy. So what's interesting is the misreading of Chinese intentions. And this is something that came up quite often when my Chinese friends were speaking to me, that Japan was misreading Chinese actions in history. And as a result, they were taking a defensive approach, that they were forming unneeded alliances with the United States, and that the security choices that Prime Minister Abe was making, whether it was the collective security law or the secrecy law or strengthening the US-Japan alliance, were really not necessary. They felt that, I think that our Chinese colleagues, their self-understanding of China was as having never engaged in expansionism, colonialism, or wars of aggression, and that they always thought to grow with other countries in win-win situations. I found this interesting, and just reflecting on, again, on General Wei's discussion at the Shangri-La dialogue just 2 weeks ago in Singapore, that General Wei echoed this. He talked about China never having engaged in expansionism, colonialism, or wars of aggression, which is, I found really interesting because my Southeast Asian friends had a lot to say about that. And so did my Korean friends. They had a lot of choice words, and I know a lot of bad Korean words, but I don't know a lot of good ones. And usually those bad words that I learned had to do with talking about history with China. So this is interesting for me. Again, the misreading of China's intentions from the Chinese point of view is that they're all about peaceful development, protecting core interests, spreading prosperity regionally and globally. So there may be some truth to this in the sense that I think the current government understands that its stability and sustainability will be very much about peacefully developing at home and in its region. But in practice, I think that it's been challenged, as most countries are challenged in realizing their foreign policy. And again, there's some more points here about the Japanese misreading China's intentions to create global public goods for mutual benefit and for coexistence and global joint leadership based on win-win. So these are interesting because I think how we understand ourselves often may not be based on, maybe dissimilar to how others understand us, or how others look at us, or how others interpret our behavior. I think that this is something for us to be thinking about, because there seems to be a gap between how the Chinese understand themselves and how not only Japan, but other countries understand China's behavior in the region. There was a lot of inconsistencies, and I think that very few of the Chinese scholars that I interviewed recognized this, but the misreadings of Chinese behavior seem to be inconsistent with some of the reality that I think Japan has looked at and other countries have looked at in the region, and why they are engaging in a transformative foreign policy to constrain China's behavior. And one of this is this idea of China's behavior of being assertive without context. So I have a graph here on the right, and you can see from 1989 to 2012. If we go up to 2020, you'll see that the Chinese continue to spend a lot of yuan, or US dollars, on their military expansion. And from Japan's point of view, this is really troublesome. By some estimates, the Chinese create one French fleet every year, which means that they have more ships than the Japanese, and they have more ships than even the United States. The Chinese also made the view that its actions in the East China Sea were a response to Japan changing the status quo, not aggressive. And it fits within the context of the Chinese are understanding their own behavior as reactive rather than being proactive. And if their behavior is reactive from the Chinese logic, then Japan would, if it changed its behavior, then the Chinese wouldn't be increasing their military budget, or they wouldn't be sending ships into the waters around the Senkaku Islands, which, if you've been following just this week, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs gave another formal démarche to our Chinese friends about merchant vessels going in and out of the waters of the Senkaku Islands. Even the Air Defense Identification Zone, IDIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone, from the Chinese point of view, when they declared this in the East China Sea, they saw this as an application of domestic law rather than being a tactic to engage in salami slicing and trying to erode away Japan and Korea's claims in the region. The South China Sea island building is not about power projection, but about a public good. And they also understood the One Belt, One Road, or Belt Road Initiative, and the AIB similar, as being something that was very much about building a public good. And even in the 2015 parade that we saw in Beijing, that was celebrating the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. And from the Chinese point of view, they use this word, the battle against Japanese and global fascism. From the Chinese point of view, this parade was not aggressive or a demonstration of power, but was more about the domestic audience and trying to inculcate pride in Chinese development. So I find that how our Chinese friends understand Japan at many different levels, and how they explain themselves to be somewhat disconnected. But this disconnect is interesting because it does demonstrate that they understand that there's a reactive, proactive side to the relationship. The question is who is being proactive, who is being active in the encounters that these two countries have vis-a-vis each other, and what is the purpose of that behavior. Mind you, and I think that it's important to say that this research was really from 2012 to 2020. So we're not talking about the current aggressive behavior towards Taiwan. I haven't really incorporated the wolf warrior diplomacy or the much more aggressive side of China that we've seen in the past 2 years. And that's purposeful because, again, I'm looking at how they understood Prime Minister Abe and Japanese foreign policy during that period rather than the COVID period. So, some of the take homes that we can have that I think it's really difficult for us to have a strict realist, liberalist, or constructivist theories and understanding their analysis, because there were so many different ways of thinking about Japan. Importantly, in this context, I want to just focus on that the securitization of Japan-China relations is really in line with Buzan's ideas of securitization theory. And what that means is thinking about the relationship has been securitized by both sides. And as a result, both sides need, or if both sides want to desecuritize the relationship, then they need to start to make moves to strengthen the confidence that the counterpart has in their security positioning within the region. I think lastly, that we see Japan responding to how they understand China trying to maximize its power within the region. And they see this as an important way to be thinking about why Japan is engaging in its particular approach to Japan or to China, but from many of the Chinese scholars' point of view, that the Japanese were misreading Chinese intentions. So a few take-homes that I think are important for us to be thinking about is that there was a lot of pessimism in the Chinese community about Japanese foreign policy, either under Prime Minister Abe or not. And although I haven't touched upon the past 2 or 3 years of their thinking, I don't think this has changed. In fact, I think it's deepened, both from the standpoint of not having enough information, but also some of the effects of COVID have created, again, a more nationalistic country that is reacting to many, many, many different things. And one of the outputs of that reaction is to securitize almost every aspect of its encounters with the international community. Another interesting point that I think is important, that the Sino-Japanese War itself, and remember there's two, right? From 1984 and 1894, when there was the first Sino-Japanese War and the Japanese defeated the Qing dynasty. That would be considered the first Japanese War. The second Japanese-Chinese War, of course, began in 1931 or 1937, depending on where you draw the line of Japan's aggression. But I think what was interesting in the discussions that I had with many of the Chinese scholars is that the war issue was not as much of a core part of the relationship. And I think this is interesting, that although we hear a lot about history, from the policy point of view, it's not so much history. They all agreed that foreign policy since 2012 has strengthened in terms of securitization. They agreed with nationalism as being one of the core areas. I also thought that they did not recognize the increased nationalism within their country as much as they acknowledged, or they pointed out the increased nationalism within the Japanese context. And I thought this was really interesting, having spent a lot of time in both countries. If you walk down Harajuku or in Shibuya or Shinjuku, you're not going to see a lot of anti-Chinese movements, right? There's a lot of young guys wearing makeup and out with their girls or whoever they are, rather than talking about China. Where in the Chinese context, nationalism turns up like a radio volume button on a radio. It goes up and down. And I think that there is a role for the government in turning the nationalism up at different times. And a really good example of that, of course, was when the Japanese nationalized the islands, the Senkaku Islands. We saw, a lot of movements in Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou, but we didn't see it in the countryside. A year later, when Prime Minister Abe in December 2013 visited Yasukuni Shrine, there was no anti-Japanese protests. So to me, this demonstrates that the nationalism in the Chinese context is carefully curated and allowed or not. And this is what I mean by saying that it can be turned up or turned down. And of course, we haven't seen any of those anti-Japanese protests emerge over the past 10 years, which also suggests that there is an ability by the state to control nationalism's expression on the streets. But they do allow for the expression on the internet through Weibo or WeChat. And there's a lot of examples of this. Lastly, and I think importantly, the scholars, despite their pervasive pessimism, they felt that economic, environmental, and technological cooperation was a platform for trust building during the Abe administration. And they gave evidence of the visit of Prime Minister Abe to Beijing in November 2019, where Prime Minister Abe and President Xi signed 55 agreements to build infrastructure in third countries. And they felt that this was a pretty good evidence that these two countries, despite many of their differences, they could find opportunities to cooperate on infrastructure. And they also felt that the environment was also an area that they could build in. Fast forwarding today, I think some of these conclusions remain true. The pessimism is still there. I think that the Sino-Japanese War as a core issue is less apparent. It's not as critical as the security issues facing each other. Foreign policy is even more securitarized today, and nationalism has increased. Economic, environmental, and technological cooperation and these platforms, while on paper are possible, I think that it's increasingly challenged to cooperate in these areas, at least until August 2023, after our Chinese friends have finished the 20th Chinese Central Party Communist Party Conference in November, and in 2023 when they complete the National People's Congress, where we will have a better understanding of where President Xi sits within the Chinese political sphere. Will he have consolidated power? Will they be in a position where they can open up the country from COVID and try to de-escalate the position? Or will they come out of these two important meetings feeling even more nationalistic and more determined to take back Taiwan as soon as possible? And if this is the case, I think there's no possible hope for economic, environmental, and technological cooperation, not only with Japan, but also with the United States and other like-minded countries. So that's what's, any kind of research, some of the conclusions and analysis should be consistent, and some will always change as the conditions change. And this particular, hopefully, book that will try to come out this year will demonstrate that the relationship has moved in a very negative direction, but there are potential platforms for cooperation moving forward. And I'll stop there and love to open up to questions from our audience.